My husband stood across the courtroom and smiled at me. Not the warm smile I had fallen in love with 34 years ago. This was the other kind. The kind that said he had already won. He hadn't. He just didn't know it yet. Because standing in the hallway outside that courtroom door was a woman named Constance Yardley, his business partner of 12 years, carrying a leather briefcase and an expression on her face that I had never seen directed at me before. Resolve. I had spent the better part of 2 years believing. Constance was the reason my marriage had fallen apart. I had convinced myself that she was the other woman, the distraction, the explanation for everything that had gone wrong. I had blamed her for things I couldn't yet prove and hated her for a life I didn't fully understand. I was wrong about almost everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, I want to ask you something. Have you ever given everything you had to someone, every sacrifice, every quiet moment, every dollar you didn't spend on yourself, and then watched that person look straight at you and pretend you were never really there? If you have, please leave me a comment below. I read every single one. And while you're here, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy stories about strength, truth, and starting over. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing how far these stories travel. My name is Harriet Callum. I am 63 years old, and this is the story of how I lost everything I thought I had and found everything I didn't know I needed. I met my husband Lawrence Callum at a church potluck dinner in Macon, Georgia. I was 29 years old. He was 32. He wore a blue button-down shirt with a small mustard stain near the second button that he kept trying to hide with his elbow. I thought that was the most endearing thing I had ever seen. Lawrence wasn't rich. He wasn't polished. He drove a pickup truck with a cracked rear window and kept a rubber band around his wallet because the snap had broken 2 years earlier and he'd never gotten around to replacing it. But he was steady. That's the word I always used for him back then. Steady. Like something you could lean against without worrying it would move. We married 11 months after that potluck dinner. The wedding was small. My sister Opal sang a hymn slightly off-key, and we all pretended not to notice. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. Lawrence's father shook my hand at the reception and said, "Take care of my boy." I promised I would. I kept that promise for 34 years. In the early years, money was the constant presence in the room that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Lawrence worked for a property management company, long hours, modest pay, the kind of job that wears a man down slowly without him realizing it. I worked as a billing coordinator at a medical office in town. Between the two of us, we made just enough to stay current on the mortgage and put a little aside each month. Our son Douglas arrived 3 years after we married. Then our daughter Faye, 2 years after that. Life became beautiful and exhausting in equal measure. There were stretches where Lawrence and I didn't finish a single conversation for weeks because something always interrupted us. A fever, a bad dream, a permission slip that needed signing before 7 in the morning. But we were happy. That part was real. Then one evening, Lawrence came home from work and sat at the kitchen table without taking off his coat. That was unusual enough that I turned off the stove and sat down across from him. He had been talking for months about striking out on his own. A property development company. Small to start, focused on commercial real estate in the region. He believed the market was ready. He believed he had the knowledge. What he didn't have was the money. He spread the numbers across the table between us. Startup costs, projected expenses, timeline to first revenue. I studied every page. He watched my face the whole time. "I can't do this without you," he said finally. He wasn't being romantic. He was being honest, which I appreciated more. I had saved carefully over the years. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to serve as the initial collateral on a business loan. Enough to give a bank officer in downtown Macon a reason to say yes where he otherwise would have said no. I also had the stronger credit history between us. Lawrence had gone through a rough period in his late 20s, before we met, that had left some marks on his record. Mine was clean. The loan officer, a careful man named Mr. Thibodeau, reviewed our application across a wide wooden desk and pushed his glasses up twice before speaking. "Mrs. Callum," he said, "if you're willing to co-sign as the primary guarantor, I think we can make this work." Lawrence immediately said we should think about it more. I immediately said yes. I understood the risk. If the company failed, the liability would come to me. But Lawrence's dream felt like our dream, and in that moment I couldn't distinguish between the two. So I signed. My name went on those documents. My financial history, my savings, my word, all of it backing Lawrence Calsom's future. The company started with Lawrence, one leased office space above a dry cleaner on Mulberry Street, and more ambition than clients. I kept my job at the medical office, but spent every evening and weekend doing the administrative work that a small business generates in overwhelming quantities. Lease agreements, vendor contracts, payroll processing once there were employees to pay, correspondence with county planning offices, tax filings. Douglas was in the 4th grade. Faye was in 2nd. There were school events I attended exhausted and left early. There were dinners I served from a can because there was simply no time. Lawrence and I would pass each other in the kitchen, sometimes like two people, sharing a small boat in rough water, aware of each other, grateful for each other, but too focused on staying afloat to say much. We talked about it, though. On the occasional Sunday morning when the children were still asleep and the house was quiet, we would sit with coffee and talk about what we were building. Lawrence had a way of describing the future that made it feel already real, already present. I held on to those conversations for a long time. Years and years. The company grew. 1 employee became 5. 5 became 14. Projects expanded from small commercial tenants to larger developments. Lawrence's name started appearing in regional business publications. He was invited to speak at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon. Then another. Then a conference in Atlanta. I remember standing in our backyard one summer evening, while Lawrence grilled steaks and the children chased fireflies across the lawn. He came up behind me and put his arms around my shoulders and said quietly, "None of this happens without you. You know that." I believed him completely. I kept that memory for a long time. I returned to it whenever things were hard. Proof that he saw me. Proof that we were still the same two people from that kitchen table. I should have paid closer attention to when he stopped saying things like that. The changes came slowly, the way they always do when you don't want to see them. Lawrence began investing heavily in his appearance. Suits that cost more than our first month's mortgage payment, a watch I didn't recognize from a brand I'd never heard of. I didn't make anything of it. He had worked hard. He had earned success. Of course he wanted to look the part. But then there was the way he talked about me at events. Or rather, the way he stopped. There was a dinner at a hotel ballroom in Atlanta, a regional real estate association awards ceremony. Lawrence's company was being recognized for a development project. I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, deep green, fitted, something I'd spent more than I usually would. I felt good in it. At the table, Lawrence introduced me to his colleagues the way you might introduce a distant cousin you aren't certain everyone will remember. No warmth, no pride, just my wife, Harriet. And then he was already looking past me toward the next handshake. One of his colleagues, a man named Brenton, who laughed too loudly at everything, made a comment about spouses being the quiet backbone, and Lawrence smiled vaguely and said nothing. Driving home, I asked if something was wrong. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "You barely spoke to me all evening." "I was working the room." That's what those events are for. I looked out the passenger window at the highway lights moving past. "You used to introduce me differently." He didn't answer. After that, I started noticing other things. The phone behavior. Lawrence had always been someone who left his phone on the kitchen counter, face up, unremarkable. Sometime in the past year that had changed without my noticing exactly when. Now it was always face down, always password protected. He checked it immediately when notifications came in, then set it back down without mentioning what he'd seen. There was his name that appeared in conversations without warning. Constance Yardley. She had joined the company about 3 years earlier as a business development partner, someone Lawrence had met through a mutual contact in commercial real estate. He spoke about her, the way people speak about a capable colleague they respect enormously. Constance handled this. Constance brought in that client. Constance restructured the Southeastern portfolio. I paid attention because her name came up so often, but I told myself it was professional. That was the story I believed for longer than I should have. Then our son Douglas made an offhand comment during one Sunday lunch. Something about how often his father mentioned his partner Constance at the last family gathering. Douglas said it lightly, with no particular meaning behind it. But the word partner landed differently than it had before. I started watching more carefully. And what I found? The hotel receipt that fell from his jacket pocket. One Thursday evening, the weekend conference that his assistant confirmed had ended a full day earlier than Lawrence had told me. The voice message I accidentally heard before he took the phone from my hand and said I was holding it wrong. All of it began assembling into a shape I didn't want to name. Our 34th anniversary was approaching. I made a reservation at the restaurant where Lawrence had proposed. A quiet place near the river, nothing extravagant, just meaningful. I told him about it a week ahead of time. He nodded and said, "Sure," and went back to his emails. The night itself was worse than I had prepared for. He was late picking me up. He spent the drive on a call that he didn't end when we pulled into the parking lot, finishing it with his door half open while I waited. Inside the restaurant, he sat across from me and looked at his phone more than at my face. When our appetizers arrived, he checked a message and actually smiled, a real, unguarded smile, before he caught himself and set the phone down. "Who was that?" I asked. "Work. On our anniversary." He picked up his wine glass. "Business doesn't know what day it is, Harriet." I set my fork down. "Lawrence, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He looked at me then, not warmly, more like a man calculating how much this was going to cost him. "Are you having an affair?" He didn't deny it immediately. That was the first confirmation, the one that came before words. He set his own fork down, took a slow breath, and then said something I never expected. "You've been stuck, Harriet, for years." I didn't know how to tell you. I stared at him. "Stuck," I repeated. "You're still thinking about this marriage like it's 1995. Like we're still that couple scraping by on Mulberry Street. I've grown. The company has grown. I need someone who—" He stopped. "Who what?" He looked past me toward the window. "Someone who moves with me," he said finally. I felt the blood leave my face. I thought about the loan officer's desk, about the years of payroll records I'd organized at midnight, about the vendor contracts I'd negotiated while Douglas had chicken pox and I was running a fever myself, about the way Lawrence used to say none of this happens without you. "After everything," I said quietly, "that is what you think of me." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later, and what was inside them rearranged my understanding of the preceding 18 months entirely. Lawrence was claiming the business as a solely acquired marital asset developed through his individual's expertise and professional network. My contributions were described, in the language of his attorney's filing, as general household and administrative support customary to the marital relationship. Customary. I read that word 4 times. I called my daughter Faye that evening. She lived in Charlotte with her husband and their 2 children, and she had always been the one in the family I thought of as honest, sometimes uncomfortably so. She picked up on the second ring and I told her about the papers. There was a pause before she spoke. "Mom," she said carefully, "I think you need to think about what kind of fight this is worth." I didn't understand what she meant yet. Not fully. But I would. 2 days later, Douglas called. He used almost the same language, something about keeping things civil, something about how his father had built something real and important, and a long legal battle would only hurt everyone. I sat in my kitchen listening to my son speak in someone else's rhythm and felt something shift inside me. Not grief exactly. Something colder than grief. He had gotten to them before the papers had even landed in my mailbox. That evening, I went to the storage room off our garage and pulled out 4 banker boxes I hadn't opened in years. Inside them was the administrative history of Lawrence Callum's company, the early loan documents with my signature, handwritten notes in my handwriting from vendor calls in the company's 2nd year, the original business plan, which Lawrence had drafted and I had typed, corrected, formatted, and submitted to the bank. Copies of personal financial disclosures I had provided to secure financing. Payroll spreadsheets. Client correspondence. Also a letter. I nearly missed it. Folded inside a manila folder labeled Tax 2005. It was written in Lawrence's handwriting on a sheet of yellow legal paper dated from the company's 5th year, during a stretch when 2 large projects had stalled, and we genuinely didn't know if the business would survive. Harriet. I have been trying to figure out how to say this properly, and I cannot. You have kept this family and this company alive through something I'm not sure I could have survived alone. If we make it through this year, it is because, not me, because of you. I love you. Lai read it 3 times in the storage room with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Then I carried everything inside and called an attorney. Her name was Sylvia Oduya. I found her through a referral from a woman in my church who had been through a difficult divorce 4 years earlier, and spoke about Sylvia the way people speak about someone who told them a hard truth they needed to hear. Sylvia listened to everything. She looked at the documents methodically. When I showed her the loan guarantee, something in her expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. This establishes your direct financial risk at the company's formation, she said. That's not administrative support. That's foundational. Then I told her about the financial disclosures in the filing, the assets Lawrence had listed, the numbers that didn't match what I knew about the company's recent growth. She was quiet for a moment. The numbers in his disclosure don't account for a liquidity level consistent with recent development revenue, she said carefully. Which raises a question about where certain proceeds have been directed. What does that mean? She removed her glasses eyes and looked at me directly. It means we may be dealing with concealment as well as mischaracterization. And if that's true, it changes the nature of this case significantly. Within 2 weeks, Sylvia had retained a forensic accountant. What emerged over the following month was a pattern. Not obviously criminal at first glance. Not the kind of thing that draws immediate attention, but a pattern nonetheless. Recurring transfers to a subsidiary entity that had no operational history in the company's disclosed records. Payments categorized as consulting fees to a firm that appeared to have only one client. Lawrence's company. Money moving, methodically and quietly, into accounts that were not reflected in the marital asset disclosure. Someone had been planning this for a long time. And then, 6 weeks before the scheduled hearing, I received a phone call. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't in my contacts, and I had been avoiding unknown calls since the divorce filing, assuming they were from Lawrence's attorney's office. But something made me pick up. Mrs. Callum? The voice was professional, careful. Yes, a pause. My name is Constance Yardley. I sat down. For a full 5 seconds I didn't say anything. The woman I had blamed for the end of my marriage. The woman whose name had appeared in so many conversations that it had become almost physical to me, like a presence in the room. I understand if you want to hang up, she said. I would understand that completely. Then why are you calling? Another pause. Because there are things you don't know, and I've been waiting too long to say them. We met at a coffee shop near Constance's office 2 days later. She was already there when I arrived, sitting with her hands around a cup she wasn't drinking from. She was younger than I had imagined, late 40s, I guessed, with the kind of composure that looks like confidence until you look more carefully and see that it's actually effort. She stood when she saw me. Mrs. Callum. Thank you for coming. I sat across from her without returning the pleasantry. Tell me what you need to tell me. She nodded. She had expected that. I know what people at the company assumed about me, she said. I know what you probably assumed. Did Lawrence have an affair? I asked directly. Not with me. No hesitation, no flinching. Then why? Because he let people think otherwise. Her voice was even, but her jaw was tight. For years. It was useful to him that people watched me and made assumptions. It kept them from watching other things. The coffee shop noise receded. I felt very still. What other things? Constance opened the portfolio case she had brought with her and placed a folder on the table between us. Her name is Nadine Forsyth, she said. I stared at the name on the documents in front of me. She's a real estate attorney based in Savannah. Lawrence has been involved with her for approximately 3 years. Her firm has received significant transfers from a consulting entity connected to the company. An entity that doesn't appear in any of the financial disclosures. Lawrence's attorneys have filed. My mouth had gone dry. You're telling me he was hiding money. I'm telling you what I found, Constance said carefully. What it means legally is for your attorney to determine. I looked at her. Why are you telling me this? She was quiet for a moment. Then, Because I watched what he did to you at the Meridian Association dinner last April. I was 3 tables away. I watched him introduce you the way someone introduces a piece of furniture. And then I drove home and thought about how long I had stayed quiet because I needed my position in that company, and I was ashamed of myself. Her voice hadn't cracked, but I could hear where it wanted to. He used me as a distraction, she said. The rumors about us suited him. Every conversation people had about whether Lawrence Callum was inappropriate with his business partner was a conversation they weren't having about Nadine Forsyth or about where the money was going. I thought about all the months I had spent directing my anger at this woman. All the times I had said her name in my head with a particular weight, a particular blame. I owe you an apology, I said. She shook her head slightly. You owe me nothing. You didn't know. Before we left, Constance handed me a second envelope, sealed, heavier than the folder. What's this? A copy of everything I have. Everything I documented over the past 18 months. She met up my eyes directly. In case anything happens before the hearing, I want your attorney to have it regardless. The drive home felt like moving through water. The week before the hearing, Constance stopped responding to messages. 1 day of silence, then 2. I called twice and reached voicemail. I texted and heard nothing back. Sylvia reached out through professional channels and received no reply. By the 4th day, I wasn't sleeping well. Sylvia tried to reassure me. We have the financial documentation. We have the loan records. We have Lawrence's own letter. We have a case regardless. I know, I said. And I did know. But Constance's testimony about how the company's rumors had been manufactured, about the consulting entity, about Nadine Forsyth, that was the piece that made the hidden assets undeniable rather than merely suspicious. Without her, we could demonstrate what I had contributed. We couldn't as easily demonstrate what Lawrence had taken. The night before the hearing, I came home to find a padded envelope in my mailbox. No postage, no return address. Someone had placed it there by hand. Inside was a flash drive and a single index card with 5 words written in small, careful print. Everything is on here. Go. I sat at my kitchen table until midnight going through the contents with Sylvia, who came over within 40 minutes of my call. What we found was meticulous. Every document Constance had described, plus account statements Lawrence had never disclosed, plus email correspondence between Lawrence and Nadine Forsyth that referenced, in language that was not subtle, the movement of funds away from the marital estate. She's not coming tomorrow, I said. Sylvia looked at the flash drive in her hand. She already did everything she needed to do. The courthouse in downtown Macon was cold in the way that institutional buildings always are. A chill that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with what happens inside them. I sat beside Sylvia at the plaintiff's table and arranged my hands in my lap and breathed slowly. Lawrence sat across the room with his attorney, a man named Clifford Brash, who had the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to winning before the other side fully understood the rules. Lawrence himself looked calm, settled, like a man who had already finished calculating. He glanced at me once, a brief look, something in it said, "This won't take long." I looked back at him without expression. The hearing began. Clifford Brash opened with the expected narrative. Lawrence as the architect of a business built through his own vision and industry, the marital contributions on my side amounting to domestic partnership rather than commercial participation. He used the word periphery twice, which I noted. Sylvia's response was methodical in a way I had come to deeply appreciate about her. She didn't dramatize. She presented. The loan documents, my signature as primary guarantor, displayed on a screen large enough for the judge to read without leaning forward. The original business plan with the formatting I had contributed documented. Payroll records with my name on the processing certifications. Vendor contracts negotiated in phone calls I had personally conducted. Lawrence's own letter, which Sylvia read aloud in full, including the line, "If we make it through this year, it is because of you. Not me. Because of you." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Lawrence's jaw had tightened visibly. Clifford Brash made a note on his legal pad that he underlined twice. Then, Sylvia turned to the financial disclosures. The forensic accountant, a precise and unhurried woman, named Dr. Frances H.E., took the stand and walked through 18 months of documented financial movement, recurring transfers to an entity called Yardley Southern Consulting, which, despite its name, had no connection to Constance Yardley, a fact Sylvia made sure was established clearly and early. Payments that did not correspond to any vendor in the company's operational records. Account activity that suggested a deliberate effort to reduce the apparent marital estate prior to filing. Lawrence's attorney objected repeatedly. The judge allowed Sylvia to proceed. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. The courtroom doors opened. Constance Yardley walked in. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who hadn't slept well and had decided to show up anyway. She carried her leather portfolio, and she did not look at Lawrence as she walked to her seat. Lawrence looked at her. That was all I needed to see. Sylvia requested that Constance be permitted to testify. After a brief procedural exchange, the judge agreed. Constance settled into the witness chair with the stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in her own mind and had finally stopped rehearsing it. Sylvia's questions were measured. Employment relationship. Length of professional association. Nature of responsibilities. Constance answered each one clearly, without embellishment then. Were you ever, personally or romantically involved with Lawrence Callum? No. Flat and certain. Was there ever any suggestion within the company that you were? Constance looked at Lawrence for the first time since entering the room. Yes, frequently. Did Lawrence Callum ever correct those suggestions? A pause. Never. Do you have a sense of why? Clifford Brash objected on grounds of speculation. The judge allowed Constance to answer from direct observation. Because it was more useful to him for people to be watching me, she said. The room was very quiet. Sylvia approached the evidence table. Miss Yardley, are you familiar with an entity called Yardley Southern Consulting? Something moved across Constance's face. Controlled anger, I thought. Yes. Lawrence used my name without my knowledge or consent to establish a shell entity for the purpose of routing funds outside standard company accounting. I discovered this approximately 14 months ago. The noise in the courtroom happened in stages. First murmuring, then the judge's call for order. Clifford Brash was on his feet. Lawrence had gone very still. Constance continued through the cross-examination with the same steadiness. Every attempt to undermine her credibility met the same response. Documented evidence, specific dates, corroborated records. She had not come into this room unprepared. At one point, Clifford Brash suggested that Constance was testifying out of professional grievance. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite patience. I am testifying, she said, because a woman who co-signed a loan, managed administrative operations for a decade, sacrificed professional advancement, and built a life alongside this company deserves to have a record that reflects the truth. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Sylvia stood to introduce the final piece of evidence, the email correspondence between Lawrence and Nadine Forsyth, which had arrived on the flash drive the night before. Lawrence stood up. Objection! His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. Something under the confidence, something that sounded like fear. The judge looked at him. Mr. Callum, please allow your attorney to represent you. Lawrence sat back down. Clifford Brash objected on procedural grounds regarding the origin of the documents. Sylvia walked the judge through the chain of custody. The documents were admitted. The emails were not lengthy. They didn't need to be. Taken together, they outlined a deliberate effort, spanning 16 months, to move funds from accounts that would have been subject to marital asset disclosure into structures that would not. Lawrence's own words, in his own sent folder, describing the arrangement in practical terms that left very little room for reinterpretation. When proceedings recessed for the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. I sat at the plaintiff's table for a few minutes after the room began to empty. Sylvia organized her folders. Across the room, Lawrence was speaking quietly with Clifford Brash. Whatever Clifford was saying, Lawrence did not look like a man hearing good news. I found Constance in the hallway. She was alone, sitting on a bench near the window with her portfolio on her lap, looking out at the parking structure. I sat beside her. For a moment, neither of us said anything. You came, I said finally. She kept looking at the window. I almost didn't. I know. Another silence. I'm going to lose my position at the company, she said. Probably. I know that too. She turned to look at me. Was it worth it, do you think? For you? I thought about the letter on yellow legal paper. About a potluck dinner in Macon and a man with a mustard stain on his shirt. About 34 years and 2 children and one signature that set everything in motion. It's not about worth, I said. It's about what's true. She nodded slowly. Yeah. I reached over and put my hand on hers briefly. She didn't pull away. The ruling came 3 weeks later. Judge Marian Alcott, a woman in her late 50s who had listened to every word of the proceedings with the particular quality of attention that makes you feel both seen and understood, delivered her findings on a Tuesday morning in early spring. She did not rush. She addressed the marital contributions first, the loan guarantee, the administrative and operational support documented across 14 years of company records, the professional sacrifices, the original financing structure. Her language was careful and specific, and it felt, sitting in that room listening, like being named after years of someone trying to make you nameless. The business was not, the judge found, the product of one person's effort. The marital estate would be divided accordingly. The numbers she outlined were substantial, more than Lawrence had offered in any of his settlement proposals, more than I had let myself hope for in the darker weeks of the preceding months. Then Judge Alcott addressed the financial disclosure irregularities. Her language here was more measured, because the legal consequences of that matter would be determined in a separate proceeding. But she made clear that the evidence raised significant questions about the completeness and accuracy of the assets Lawrence had reported. Across the room, Lawrence sat without moving. Clifford Brash wrote something on his legal pad and then stopped writing. At the conclusion of the ruling, after everyone had begun to file out, I sat for a moment in the quiet of the emptying courtroom. Sylvia was speaking with a clerk near the door. Constance had left before the reading began. She had a flight to catch. She'd told me the day before, some relocation she'd been considering for a while. I thought she probably needed the distance. Lawrence appeared in my peripheral vision. He walked over slowly, as if he wasn't certain he should be doing it, and stopped a few feet away. I looked at him. He looked older than the man I had married, not in years, in something harder to name. I didn't think it would go this, he said. I didn't say anything. I want you to know. He stopped, started again. I know what you did for the company. I always knew. I know you did, I said. He seemed surprised. That's what makes it worse, Lawrence, not better. He looked down, looked up, looked away, and then he walked out of the courtroom and I watched him go, and I felt nothing that I had expected to feel. Not triumph, not grief, just the particular quiet of something that has finally and completely ended. The house sold 6 months later. I bought a small place on a tree-lined street in Savannah, which was perhaps a strange choice given everything. But the city itself had done nothing wrong, and I had always loved the light there in the mornings. I furnished it slowly, every choice my own. Douglas and I had a long conversation over the course of several Sunday phone calls. It wasn't easy. He had made choices during the divorce that I could not pretend away. But I had raised him, and I knew the difference between someone who had chosen wrong and someone who was irredeemable. We worked through it carefully. It took longer than I wanted and shorter than I feared. Faye and I were mostly fine. She had said what she had said out of fear for everyone, including me. She told me that later, and I believed her, and we moved on. Constance and I exchanged occasional messages. She had relocated to Nashville and was consulting independently, which suited her. In one of her messages, she mentioned that she was sleeping better than she had in years. I understood completely. I started volunteering at a women's legal resource center in Savannah. Not because I had any legal training, but because I had something some of the women coming through those doors needed more than legal training. I had lived through the thing they were in the middle of. I knew what it felt like to hold a document with your own signature on it, and have someone tell a room full of people that you hadn't really been there. The woman who ran the center, a retired attorney named Claudette, told me once that the most useful things I did was simply stay in the room with people. "You don't run from it," she said. "They can see that." I thought about that for a long time afterward. One afternoon, months into the work, I was walking back to my car after a long day at the center when I stopped on the sidewalk outside without quite knowing why. The evening light was coming through the Spanish moss in long, flat angles. The street was quiet. I stood there and thought about a courtroom in Macon. About Lawrence's face in the moment Constance walked through those doors. about the letter on yellow legal paper, folded in a manila folder, waiting 34 years to be read aloud in a room full of people who finally understood what it meant. I thought about Constance, who had been afraid and shown up anyway, and I thought about something that took me longer to understand than it probably should have. That the most dangerous thing Lawrence had ever done to me wasn't the affair, or the financial deception, or the divorce papers. It was 30 years of slow, patient work to make me believe my contributions were ordinary, customary, unremarkable, because the moment I stopped believing that, everything changed. It is never too late to stop believing the things someone else decided about your worth. Never too late to walk into a storage room and open the boxes and find the evidence of who you actually were. Never too late to sit across from an attorney who listens, or to receive an envelope with no return address that changes the shape of everything. And it is never too late to understand that the person who called you replaceable was always, in the end, describing only themselves.